Welcome to the Schools Inclusion Project meeting. The headline topic that we're discussing today is tackling discrimination in education. We're obviously grateful that you've all turned up, and we welcome you to our new building if you haven't been here before. The Schools Inclusion Project is part of the wider work that we do in the Chambers public law team. It's obviously one of the important areas of work that we do, and it's an area of work that is obviously under huge pressure, as are many other areas. And I've just seen Jonathan, and we want to give this area particular priority in our work because we've seen through all the research and from hard experience that excluding children from school has such profound life impacts on their lives, and we are all well aware of its discriminatory impacts, and that's why this is the topic of this discussion today. There will be an opportunity to have a chat afterwards and to share your thoughts on what's on the seminar and what's happening in your practice and what we might be doing next. What we're going to cover is looking at the work that's coming from the frontline organisations that the School Inclusion Project works with, as well as policy professionals and legal practitioners, looking how we can challenge the pressing issues in education. The areas that you're aware of include the racialised criminalisation of children in schools, and we are very fortunate to have Kasim Ali from Action for Race Equality speaking today. We'll be looking at changes to the Department of Education's equality monitoring of permanent exclusions, and Deborah Tyfield from Liverpool Law Clinic is going to talk to us about that. We're also looking at legal aid for school exclusion appeals, and that's a big part of the strategy that we set out for the Schools Inclusion Project, that we would look to try to ensure that there was public funding available for different ways in which school exclusions occur, and Ollie from Garden Court is going to speak about that. And then finally, we're going to look at the upcoming special educational needs reforms, which have had quite a bit of publicity, not least because it looks like the government's solution to special educational needs is to abolish it as an idea and a concept and an experience. And we're very fortunate to have Gillian Doherty from the SEND Action to talk to us about that. Finally, we are keen to encourage participation in the Schools Inclusion Project so that it can meet its purposes, and to work with Communities Empowerment Network and the Coram's Children's Legal Centre and Law Centres Network to seek to facilitate access to justice for children and parents who are let down and failed by the school system. Our central mission is to seek to address, where we can, access to justice for those who've been subject to systemic discrimination in the education system. And these meetings, which have now become a regular meeting, are part and parcel of trying to ensure that as many people and organisations continue to be involved in that work, we keep the momentum going, and that we try and hit some of the policy priorities that we set at the initial establishment of the organisation. But that really is about collective work, and is obviously ongoing in an extremely challenging and sometimes hostile environment. So with that introduction, I'm going to ask first of all for Kazim to speak. Kazim works for the Action for Racial Equality, is a policy and research officer, and is looking at racial disparities in education, employment and the criminal justice system. It does convene an education network which brings together Black and Asian-led organisations working in this space. Kazim has worked before in access and widening participation, improving inequality in higher education, which is often an area of the education system that doesn't get so much focus, but I'm sure should, and has worked with schools, the sixth form colleges and universities to identify structural racism in educational outcomes and inadequate curricula and environments that restrict young people's opportunities. You're going to find out how passionate he is about addressing educational equality and seeking to ensure that young people of colour have better opportunities and a fairer access to opportunities, as well as ensuring that we seek to recognise and challenge the discrimination, whichever aspects of the system it occurs.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone. As mentioned, my name is Kasim Ali. I'm a Policy and Research Officer at Action for Race Equality. Just to say a little bit more about the charity I work for. It's a national charity that's been going for 35 years or so, which is often unusual in the race equality charity sector for an organisation to be so long running. And one of the hopes of what we bring to the table there is a kind of an awareness of what works in the longer term. The policy work that we've been doing around criminal justice is well established and long running. Our chair has been on secondment to the MOJ. We work with organisations like MOPAC, HMPPS, the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime, and sit on several advisory boards for that work. When I came into Action for Race Equality over a year and a half ago, I was asked to kind of increase our presence in the policy world for education. So our work kind of focuses on young Black, Asian and mixed heritage people between the ages of 16 to 25, and as mentioned, kind of covers education, criminal justice and employment. And the span of those three, kind of we can see the ways in which school exclusion sits often at the nexus of those, so it's kind of a strong priority for us. I will say we also have a Windrush Justice portion of our work in which we do onward funding and provide capacity building to organisations supporting people with Windrush Justice claims, which is a big part of some of the stuff we do as well. In terms of our schools work, we have a long-running mentoring programme, and that's really informed the way in which we go about working with schools and young people. The programme is called Roots to Success. It was in partnership with Communities Empowerment Network, which I know is part of this forum, for over 10 years. And we provide role models and mentoring to young Black, Asian and mixed heritage people in schools, trying to build their confidence, give them opportunities to progress through school in ways in which they are often denied. In terms of what our policy priorities are and kind of what we see as the ways in which racial disproportionality and injustice play out in the education system, we know that it's widespread in schools across a variety of areas. Attainment is a big one that is always brought up, ways in which Black, Asian, mixed heritage children systematically attain less well than white British students. The recruitment and retention of teachers, we know that we have a huge recruitment problem for teachers in this country in general. It gets even worse for Black, Asian, mixed heritage professionals. Many Black, Asian, mixed heritage students will never be taught by a teacher who shares their ethnicity. We're interested also in the curriculum. We've done a lot of work this year around the curriculum review and the ways in which the current curriculum omits issues of race, migration, empire, but also fails to equip teachers and young people with the racial literacy to navigate the world and the UK as it is. And then kind of to speak to the purpose of today's meeting, we focus on punitive measures as well. So the ways in which punitive measures, and that ranges from exclusion to inclusion to seclusion to detentions to school behaviour policies to the use of force in schools, all the ways in which those are also racially disparate. I will say one of the productive ways Action for Race Equality has found to address these issues over the years is to focus on statistical disparities. It can be a really useful door in, especially when trying to influence government, to say we have a measurable disparity that we've seen in, for example, Black Caribbean boys are 3 times more likely to be excluded than white British pupils at secondary level. We've got a measurable disparity, and kind of using that Lamry principle of explain or reform, what are you going to do about it? Either tell us why it exists, and we'll tell us what you're going to do to address it. And kind of with varying degrees of success, I will say the focus on data often, I find, is one which can sometimes detract from focusing on solutions, being asked to prove again and again the realities of what Any kind of Black, Asian, mixed heritage people who've been through our British education system know that racism exists and that teachers often perpetuate narratives and systems that continue to exclude and disadvantage young people. So just to come back to the persistent disruptive behaviour, to exclusions, to punitive measures, obviously we're interested also in the school to PRU pipeline, the ways in which exclusions can often lead to encounters with the criminal justice system. We're interested in undiagnosed and unmet SEND needs, which I'm excited to hear Gillian talk about later. We know that there's huge racial disproportionality in those areas, in PRUs, but also in youth justice itself. So once if we're just focusing on young people, which is the way ARE operates, we're thinking about those same young people who are excluded or also making up a portion of the prison population where we see huge racial disparities. Don't quote me on this statistic, but I believe the last time we looked at this, 50% of the young people in custody in the UK were of Black, Asian and mixed heritage backgrounds. So despite huge strides made in youth justice over the past decade with a huge reduction of the numbers of young people in custody, that disproportionality has only got worse. I think it's really useful to say there's lots of important work going on with regards to exclusions. This forum is a really great part of that. I think we've seen charities like The Difference had a huge campaign about lost lessons, a big report they released in the last year. And this government has been making some noises about dealing with lost learning, dealing with pupils missing out on schools, repeated absences, off-rolling, the practice whereby schools might not formally exclude a pupil, but will take them off their books so they don't affect their exam results. But unless race is foregrounded as a key concern, this disproportionality will remain. One of the stats that always sticks in my head is the YMCA did a report called Young and Black about 4 years ago, and young Black students, I think 93% said they had heard racist language or experienced racism in their school. 50% said the biggest barrier to achieving for them was teacher perceptions. So I think it's hard not to overstate how big a barrier racism is in schools, and all of these kind of policy issues that ARE focuses on education, curriculum, teacher retention and recruitment, attainment, these all feed into this issue of school exclusions. And actually, if we are able to improve the experience for young Black, Asian, mixed heritage pupils in schools across the board, then it's very likely we'd see an improvement in these exclusion disparities as well. To briefly touch on the education network, which was mentioned, one of the things we have done as part of this is to bring together Black and Asian-led organisations who are working on this issue. So the organisations involved in that network are a mix of people involved in delivery. They're on the ground in schools delivering curricular content. They're organisations like Communities Empowerment Network who are doing advocacy for excluded pupils. There are organisations doing teacher training. There are organisations similar to ARE who are more involved in the policy space and trying to change government policy. Bringing those organisations together, I think, is part of an acknowledgement for us that though we see policy work as really important and kind of trying to shift the government would definitely be the easiest way to affect change on these issues, that building and organising alternatives must also be done alongside that. I'm not sure if you're aware the government's curriculum review is due to come out in the next few weeks. They likely won't have another one for another decade. We've been campaigning very hard this year to try and get anti-racism included in any form in this review. The word racism didn't appear in the first draft of their curriculum report. In the interim report, they made some acknowledgement of it, but we're not hopeful that this curriculum review is going to do much. I think I went to a recent teach-in from the Advocacy Academy, which is an organisation which works with young people to give them the tools to advocate for issues important to them, and lots of young Black, Asian, mixed heritage people, kind of 16 to 25, advocating, and delivered a placard to Bridget Phillipson's office with their own Ofsted review of the current curriculum review and how poorly it's doing on measures of racism. But one of the things that came out kind of that meeting is that we know that this is going to be difficult, and building alternatives is really, really important. So there are many organisations that are already going into schools and delivering curricular content, teacher training, etc. How do we upscale this work? How do we make it better? How do we make it stronger? With that in mind, I'll touch just to finish off on our current big project on criminalisation of young people in schools. We are working with DLA Piper, the law firm, to directly capture the views of children's parents and teachers. We're really interested in the impact, the emotional mental health impact of criminalisation in schools, but also the levels of understanding and opinions of young people and teachers on the laws, policies and systems in place currently. We're conducting interviews with young people in classrooms, with teachers, specifically with pupils who have experienced exclusion or more or other punitive measures in schools. But we're interested in more than just direct interaction with the criminal justice system. Some of the research projects that we have included and spoken to doing similar work to us are focused on things like how many police are there in schools. The government recently has changed the role of the Safer School Officer to I believe the term is a ward-based officer, and so they're not necessarily based in schools anymore, but who is letting police into schools? Who are the safeguarding leads who are making the decision that behaviour in school crosses the threshold of criminality and requires police intervention? And what are all the steps that build up to that? So we're interested in that kind of more than just that direct interaction with the criminal justice system, but the process of criminalisation as it relates to school discipline policies in general. That might also include things like prevent police on school routes, the use of force in schools. Some of the stuff I'm sure that Ollie might mention on kind of the legal recourse for young people to challenge exclusions. For that project, we're also interested in what our output looks like for that. We don't want to recreate resources that already exist. The Youth Justice Legal Centre have some really great legal guides for professionals. They're doing some research with a fantastic researcher called Patrick Williams on that issue I mentioned a moment ago about how are safeguarding leads making the decision about when police are brought into schools, and do police make young people safer? The answer for young Black, Asian and mixed heritage children is no, and we know that. But I do believe for our project there is scope for us to kind of take the legal guidance and explanation that DLA Piper are working on for us, take that alongside the work of the information we get from pupils, parents and teachers on the racialised experience of criminalisation and provide some guidance for them to be able to navigate that system better.
It's very bright sunshine.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So I'm a
Thank you.
SEND legal consultant, but I'm also a governor of a multi-academy trust. And something I was thinking on when you were speaking is I chaired an exclusion panel, and something that the parent and the advocate was putting up that we actually, as the panel, agreed with was that there was a young Black boy who was diagnosed with autism and ADHD. But it did seem he was being penalised more readily and more strongly. It was a difficult one because actually staff that were doing it were also Black, but it did seem that it was sort of excessive in some of the cases. As it happened, we overturned the exclusion, which the head was not happy about. And yes, very not happy about. But something that I thought of was, I know you're speaking to schools, and it might be worth speaking to school governors as well, because I come from an employment and SEND law background. I know about discrimination, and the clerk was saying to me, "Oh gosh, you're the first one that we've had that's been asking these questions." We haven't had it, and I could tell the staff were really shocked and they weren't prepared. But other governors don't necessarily know that. Governors get some training.
Yeah.
But a lot of this is quite nuanced and sort of deeper than what seems on the surface. So I just thought it might be useful for you to speak to school governors.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. We recently went to an event at Parliament with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Race and Education, and lots of the older Black and Asian parliamentarians were a little bit condescending, but part of what they said to us as a group was, we need more Black people as school governors. How many people in this room are school governors? And because we brought the Race, Equity and Education Network, about 40 people put their hands up, because actually we know that it can make a huge difference to have a person of colour in the room, to ask those questions, or an advocate or an ally who's able to do that. So definitely we'll add that to our list. I think that's really a really good point. I will also say that the 2 points which came up when you were talking about that case specifically about adultification, a term I'm sure people are familiar with, but the ways in which young black men specifically are perceived as being kind of more responsible for their behaviour at an earlier age, where white pupils might be given more leniency and more chance to make a difference. But also this kind of persistent disruptive behaviour, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but I believe that lots of exclusions aren't for kind of serious breaches which
this was persistent, and it's difficult because a lot of it was actually his autism, and I know that from other clients who are like white girls too, they get very similar treatment, but there did seem to be, so it's hard to untangle exactly what's going on there, but I think there did seem to be an association perhaps with him being a young black man and aggression. Actually that was autism, and he was quite sarcastic and rude, and that's often for anybody not always seen as autism or ADHD as well.
It seems like the phrase that you used was teacher perception, and obviously that's not limited to teachers, but obviously the perceptions that people have are some of the most difficult things to challenge, but recognising that it's there is obviously the key thing, and raising it through training. And obviously if you've got a person of colour in the room, then that's going to be something that's a lived experience. But I think you also said that you thought that some of the black teachers were teaching him in the same.
Yeah, it's a school in South London where there's a lot of black staff, and some of the people making those decisions were black teachers. I mean, it was a very difficult one because he was being violent and disruptive, and the school wasn't able to meet his needs at the end of the day.
I mean, that's probably the issue, isn't it? Perhaps that's what you said, is the combination of unmet or even unidentified special educational needs, and that intersectionality with race is a critical part of the difficulty.
Yeah.
And that, and that obviously can be pervasive in terms of if that's really what the central issue is, even if it's also going to manifest itself in a racially discriminatory way, then perhaps that's the key there, was the failure to identify and treat the special educational needs properly.
And there was no way that school would be able to meet his needs.
And just briefly on the issue of kind of black teachers also being part of this, I think there's it's worth noting, I think, that being a person of colour might be an initial inoculation against developing kind of racist views about young black Asian children, but it's not preventative, and it's very possible that there are teachers who share the racialization of their pupils who might perpetuate some of those narratives. It's very hard when they're kind of all around you and kind of fed into your management system, your training.
Yeah, I was just raising it because it couldn't obviously say it was racism. That was kind of that was the difficult. Yeah, that was is systematic and structural, and so that was kind of a difficulty. But I personally, and there was a black person on the panel, we did feel there was a bit of that.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting insight. Thank you very much. And one of the things that follows from that was because he was focusing on about the importance of statistics and having accurate statistical information, so that that you can't just engage in the disputing of truth or falsity or perception on the gravity of the problem. That's something that Deborah at the Liverpool Law Clinic is going to talk to us about.
We've got some questions online.
On that one. Okay.
On that one.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, perhaps we'll go to that first then. So online he's saying that part of his work we are doing as consultants is to explore the extent to which there are teachers who are more likely to initiate exclusions on the basis that the students predisproportional. That's a good word. Predispositional. Their opposite type. Do any of the panelists have any of the observations on this?
Not really. Is anyone in the room? Feel free to chip in.
Well, I suppose it's confirmed by what can be said is that
I suppose
it's perceptions of difference.
Well, I'm not sure this is a glib response or not, but I remember recently I heard a story about a teacher who had said, we can tell which students are going to be excluded when they walk in. And someone who offered a corrective to that was, you can tell which students you're going to exclude. To kind of put that activeness back on the teachers, that they are the ones making that decision, and it's not just something that happens.
Yeah.
If the question is suggesting that the answer might be different depending on which perspective it's coming from. So there might be evidence, and I think there is evidence, that white teachers are more likely to exclude black students. Sure. But I don't think the evidence runs the other way, that black teachers are more likely to exclude white students. It may be the same, that black teachers are more likely to exclude black students. But when he says the opposite, I don't think it would run the same way across the field. I think we could just conclude that from all the research that has been done, black students are more likely to be excluded, period. Black and Asian students than white students. Evidence points to that.
Yeah. And in fact, that would be confirmed by your experience, that within the system, whatever those factors are that lead to that disproportionality, they are they're structural within the system. It isn't just about the identity of the person making the decision. Jonathan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that I actually met my head of year recently, I think last year. Obviously, I've lived experience of being excluded. And I met him on the train, me and my twin brother, and he actually apologized. Mm-hmm. He said that he was the head of year, and at the time he came, he's come from a middle class background, and he just didn't have that experience of, majority of my peers were, minority ethnic. He didn't have that, got excluded at the time. He didn't have that experience with young people, and he apologized, saying that if he had more training, or just he even had more experience, or was able to understand different backgrounds, he might have not made those judgments at the time. Obviously, 15 years later, he's obviously changed his views. So I think just teacher training and awareness can help teachers make better judgments. Yeah. That's awesome.
There are a few other, I think mostly comments in the chat. Exclusions, in my opinion, can be seen as segregation of disabled students from mainstream settings. Am I right to see things this way? I think in many ways, yes, because exclusions are used to where provision can't be met, and it leads to segregation of children with unmet needs being taken out of mainstream settings. Then we've got Ian's question, which we've dealt with. Then I think there are a couple more. Anonymous attendee. I recently found out that a child together with 5 other Asian children are being taught by a normal agency TA who is Asian. Our child who is white is being taught one-to-one by the white specialist teacher. There is also an HTA who is white and also teaches the white boy. This is a resource provision with only 6 children in class.
So it's pretty blatantly discriminatory.
And then Zoe Reid adds, at government level, there often seems to be a dismissal of the intersection between disability and race, totally, and the lack of integration of or implementation of the dual discrimination provision in the Equality Act is possibly partly to blame for that. Yeah. Particularly for black, brown and racialized children. In the US, national data on disciplinary practices, including exclusion, suspension and use of force, is routinely collected and published, which helps expose these discriminatory disparities. Will the school inclusion project team be drawing on referencing this kind of data as an example of how robust reporting should look in the UK? Well, that kind of neatly segs into the next speaker, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think that would be a good introduction to Deborah's contribution. As I said, Deborah is from the brilliant organisation, the Liverpool Law Clinic, if you haven't come across its work. But her particular work is teaching on the clinical legal skills module and offering extracurricular projects to students in her specialist area. She is a practicing solicitor and she worked in both local government and private practice. She's a specialist in public law and in special education needs and social care for children. as a solicitor in local government, she provided legal advice and representation to social work teams, management teams, and elected officials on the Human Rights Act, on community care and legislation under the Children Act. And she does also have a background in working with asylum seekers and their families and others subject to immigration control. So that's a widespread background in which she's going to bring that experience to talk to us precisely about the issue and the important issue of monitoring and of obtaining reliable information about the very many different and intersectional ways in which we can see discrimination operating in the system. Deborah.
I'm assuming you can see me. Yes?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'd love to have seen your new building, but there you go. I'm stuck in Liverpool. So just to confirm, we're a university law clinic, as just described, and we provide legal advice to the people of Merseyside generally, with the assistance of our law students. There are two of us who work on education, principally focusing on special educational needs. And we've helped hundreds and hundreds of families over the years that we've been providing this service. And during that time, as many of you will also have seen, we've seen an increase in the number of children who are being permanently excluded from their schools. And that's both in the primary and the secondary sector. So in response to that, we set up a project aimed at supporting parents who wanted to challenge those exclusions and helping them prepare for an independent review panel. And on the back of this, Ollie raised with us the possibility of preparing a pre-action letter in relation to the statistics around the permanent exclusion of disabled children. So we found a client who was very willing to be our client for the purposes of a pre-action letter. Again, probably a situation you're all familiar with, a primary school age child, only 8 at the time that he was excluded, diagnosis of ADHD, and he was excluded essentially for persistent poor behaviour, which the head teacher said was having a considerable impact on the efficient daily running of the school. So bread and butter exclusion work for those of us who are involved in this. The decision of the independent review panel was to quash the decision and direct the school to reconsider his reinstatement. The governing body basically gave us a 1-paragraph response. Let's agree to disagree. He's not coming back, and that was that. So on the back of that, we thought that it would be a good case for us to consider what we can do to get better statistics around exclusions of children with special educational needs. And for these purposes, we agreed with the Secretary of State that disability was broadly the same as children with special educational needs. So I'm going to just use that interchangeably. So what was the problem? The problem really was that we didn't have reliable statistics to tell us the number of children who were being reinstated after recommendation or direction who had special educational needs. So I'm sure that you're all aware that the local authorities have to provide statistics that are published by the ONS annually. And those statistics show the number of reviews determined by an IRP, the number of reviews where a SEN expert was requested, the number of reviews upholding the exclusion, recommending reconsideration, or directing reconsideration. And then we also have the numbers who are offered reinstatement when recommended or when directed. What we don't have is how many of those children who are reinstated after the quashing of the decision have special educational needs. So that was a missing part of the puzzle. So just as by way of background, we did quote in our pre-action letter to the Secretary of State for Education these statistics, and it has moved on. We've got more recent statistics, but at the time there were 676 permanent exclusions. SEN experts were requested in nearly 69% of those IRPs. Sorry, that's the number of IRPs that were lodged, the 676. 59% of the exclusions were upheld, nearly 18% recommended reconsideration, but only 8% of those were actually offered reinstatement, and 23% were directed, but only 36% of those were actually offered reinstatement. So really, really small figures, for small numbers of people, of children actually being offered reinstatement. And we didn't know how many of those had special educational needs because that information wasn't available. The Secretary of State also has information through the school census, which I think most of you will be aware of. So the school census collects termly information about individual pupils, including their ethnicity and their special educational needs if they have them, and exclusion, but nothing that happens after that. So that was the setting of the scene. We decided, with Ollie's help, to write to the Secretary of State for Education, and we relied on the public sector equality duty, which requires a public authority to consider how their policies and decisions affect people with a protected characteristic and to gather information relevant to its duty. And then the technical guidance states that a body subject to the duty should remain alert to new evidence. So that's what we relied on. And we said that the Secretary of State has no evidence. There was no evidence that the Secretary of State was actually monitoring the outcome for disabled children after an independent review panel. And that's obvious, isn't it, from what I've just explained. And it was clear that she didn't monitor the extent to which schools are just simply refusing to reinstate disabled children when they are directed to, or they are asked to, or recommended. And without this monitoring, the Secretary of State doesn't have the information that she needs in order to make some decisions. So what we asked was that they agree there is a need to monitor the rates of reinstatement, and they tell us an action plan for doing so. So the Treasury solicitors, on behalf of the Secretary of State, prepared a full response. Interestingly, in the response, there's a little bit of history. I mean, I don't want to say blaming the other lot, but there was definitely an explanation in there. Introduced that IRPs were introduced in September 2012, and it replaced the previous system, and that there was an equality impact assessment, but that they understand that there was a disproportionate number of pupils with special educational needs being permanently excluded. So they accepted that. They say in the letter that the principal objective at that time, the principal objective of the change was to ensure that the final decision on permanent exclusion rested with the school leaders. And we know that's the case. And I don't know if any of you are reading or have read the new book from Nick Gibb, Reforming Lessons. It's apparently not a work of fiction. It's called Why English Schools Have Improved Since 2010 and How This Was Achieved. Now, I'll just, if you'll permit me, read just a very short paragraph, a line or two, page 71, if anybody wants to go and find it. And he's talking about the section is sanctioning strictness. Very important. So he says, finally, we made it impossible for review panels convened by the local authority to make schools take back pupils they had permanently excluded. Fundamentally, if a head teacher and their governing body had determined that a pupil's violent or disruptive behaviour disqualified them from membership of their community, we did not want to undermine that decision. So it was very clear that that was the whole point. Now, I haven't finished the book, but I'm not seeing any understanding there of the difficulty with children with special educational needs or any other protected characteristics. So, but it's very clear that that was the whole drive of IRPs and why IRPs could only recommend reconsideration. But we don't, there's no power if we don't know what's happening after those IRPs. And that was the subject of our request, our letter to the Treasury solicitors. So they acknowledge that they don't have that information, and what they have agreed to do is collect further information via the school's census. So the school census is termly. And so they say that that's better and more up-to-date information. And what they're going to do is collect comprehensive data on exclusions, including any review requested, the outcome of that review, and the further decisions of the governing body where relevant. So that's what they're going to collect. And that cross-references all of the information they already collect from the school census, including special educational needs, ethnicity, etc. What they haven't been able to do is put it in place immediately. In the response to our pre-action letter, they indicated that they would do this they have to amend regulations, and they were proposing for it to come in 2026-27. We were a bit impatient about that, so we asked a friendly MP to put another question. So we worked really closely with some Merseyside MPs. One in particular, Dan Carden, does lots of around education and puts questions forward when we want him to. And so we asked him to put a question forward just to confirm that what they've said is going to happen. We also snuck in a couple of other questions. So the first thing we did was ask about whether they collect the data, and they confirmed that they don't. And then we asked how they were going to ensure that that data was going to be collected in the future if they were going to. And the response from Stephen Morgan was that the department is taking action to strengthen the oversight and monitoring of all exclusion data collected through the school census, particularly for pupils who may be disproportionately affected by exclusions. This includes strengthening the monitoring of IRP decisions with a stronger focus on the reinstatement of pupils with special educational needs and/or disabilities. So they've confirmed that they're going to do that, and they've confirmed that what they're going to do is put forward some amendments, and that the amendments were expected to come into effect in 2026-27, which is probably the fastest we could do it in any event. We did put another little question in because obviously everybody in this room knows what's happening around special educational needs and all the whispers and talks about what's going to be happening and what's going to be the state of affairs afterwards. So we also asked them whether they will be a legal right to additional support, how they were going to protect the rights of parents and children to challenge local authorities in the future. And we got an answer from Catherine McKinnell, who we all know is no longer in the Department of Education, but was at the time. And she said there will always be a legal right to additional support for children and young people with special educational needs. As we've set out, the department intends to retain the SEND tribunal, and any changes we make will improve support for children and parents, stop parents from having to fight for support, and protect provision currently in place. So just more of the same that we're getting without really saying very much about how they're going to do that. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I think what's really clear from where we are at the moment is that change is coming, but I do hope that at least in this respect, in respect of the statistics that we are now going to be able to see from 26 onwards, we'll all have a little bit more information as to what the situation really looks like, and hopefully that will be a positive to enable us to continue to do the important work that we're doing.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That was fascinating and a real insight into the year zero, where they are in their duties under the Equality Act. I thought one interesting thing that we might want to just note is that the government accepted that special educational needs would meet the requirements of Section 6 of the Equality Act, because that isn't always accepted. I don't know if that's been your experience, Ollie, but I think it's
rarely accepted.
It's rarely. So I think if you've got that acceptance, that's good to have that on record. Might be good to be able to share your correspondence. We've got quite a lot of comments on that. I don't know if you want to read them out, Ollie, and see.
Yeah, sure. How about the pupils excluded who didn't appeal? Do we have data on that? I mean, one thing that Deborah, there are thousands of exclusions and only 600 and something IRPs is quite a strikingly small number. I don't know if, I can't recall, Deborah. I don't think there would be any monitoring of the protected characteristics of people. Not, I guess you could deduce it potentially from if you've got all of the data in respect of everyone excluded, and then you've got data of the people appealing, you could take one from the other and potentially work out the groups that are not applying to the IRP, because obviously there's an inequality of arms going to the IRP. If it's sort of certain groups are more like white families are more likely to get lawyered up and go to an IRP, I suspect that is what is happening. So
You're asking some more questions.
yeah,
You're
asking
getting
some
your
more
MD to
questions.
ask some more
Yeah.
questions.
And then just to clarify, will this include ethnicity? I think Deborah confirmed it did.
Well, the school census does. So if we can cross-reference all of the information from the school census, I don't see why we can't cross-reference that.
Agreed. And then Zoe has linked helpfully to the data she was referring to earlier. That's the questions from Zoom.
Yeah, I think the other group that was identified, because they are also heavily disproportionately excluded, is children from Gypsy and Traveller community. I think they're in fact they're statistically the most discriminated against group. So again, presumably that information is currently collected, is it?
So in terms of rates of permanent exclusion, there's data on ethnicity and including in relation to Gypsy Traveller, but hopefully this new monitoring in relation to IRPs will capture the same type of data that in that setting.
Yeah. So
That's right, Deborah.
Yep, that's the hope. I think so.
yeah, so the start fact of that is that they're currently in breach of the important equality impact, the public sector equality duty, and that's likely to continue for quite a substantial period of time. So I think, are you publicising, how you publicise, apart from obviously through this network, it's an important thing to publicise, isn't it? Because that's an important context for potential other challenges that might be brought to have that. It's a baseline failure. You can't begin to know what the impact is, the discriminatory impact, if you don't have the data. You just literally are at year zero. So I think that would be helpful to publicise what you've done, and congratulations on picking that piece of work up. It probably can be replicated in respect of other issues, couldn't it? So just looking at the time, I think we're going to move on to you, Ollie, now.
Yes.
To talk about the legal aid for school exclusion appeals. As you know, Ollie is a barrister at Gardencourt Chambers who is a leading practitioner in this field, and he does have a broad practice. Obviously, if you're working in this field, you need to understand public law principles, you need to have a good angle on discrimination, and he has all of that, plus he has an enormous amount of energy and commitment and passion for trying to improve the position. So we're lucky to have you, Ollie, in many ways, and thank you for talking about this particular important aspect of what has been a priority issue for the Schools Inclusion Project, access to justice.
Cool, that's embarrassing. Thanks, Steph. I'm going to be really quick because Gillian's a much more interesting speaker, and we've also talked about this topic before. Everyone who's been involved in the School Inclusion Project probably knows one of our main aims was trying to get public funding, so there'd be boots on the ground in particularly independent review panel hearings to ensure that arguments that are really quite complex sometimes about equality law, public law principles, are being argued as fully as possible by legally qualified practitioners, and try and address some of the systemic discrimination at source, try to end the impunity with which some schools exclude, and actually run some arguments that go into the higher courts upon judicial review that should hopefully hold the line in terms of fairness in school use of school exclusion. Part of that has been trying to get public funding through what's called exceptional case funding, and Steph and I and Coram Children's Legal Centre were involved in the case that was handed down earlier this year called CWJ, which has a number of helpful things in it. One of the main things is that the right to a fair hearing under the European Convention, Article 6, can be engaged in an independent review hearing, when a previously understood position was that it couldn't. And it can be engaged when there's a determination of a civil or political right. And that includes another right under the Human Rights Act, and it includes the substantive equality provisions under the Equality Act. So if there's a substantive race or disability would be the most common types of discrimination, argue that independent review panel. The independent review panel can determine that, and in doing so, it engages Article 6. That, similarly, if there's arguments about child criminal exploitation, engaging the Article 4 ECHR protection duty, that's a civil or political right. And then the safety net of exceptional case funding comes into play. And the legal aid agency, we've got, it's a bit of a frustrating non-update I have to give you. Anyone that does legal aid will know that the legal aid agency suffered the biggest data breach of any government department ever recently.
Not that recently.
Well, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
So for JR purposes, recent. Limitation purposes, it could
Okay.
be recent. But ongoing breach, which started started in April.
Yeah.
Look at solicitors in the room who have had to bear the brunt of it, which means that the legal aid agency have used this as an excuse not to determine application for exceptional case funding and sit on them. We are trying to, but we think we do have solid arguments. Abby, Ollie and I have got a good case for exceptional case funding, which we're waiting on in relation to the Article 4 protection duty. Lots of cases in relation to substantive discrimination have been lodged. The legal aid agency, if they refuse them, will face judicial review because that's the remedy. So I would encourage anyone that is doing this work to take a punt on doing at least one exceptional case funding application, and with a view to either getting it granted, hurrah, first one over the line, that'd be great, but otherwise judicially review the legal aid agency, because it's not an appeal right, it's judicially reviewable at the end of the process. You can perversely much more easily get legal aid to judicially review the legal aid agency for not granting legal aid than actually get the legal aid through exceptional case funding, which is totally bizarre, but also doable. So it is publicly funded work. And we want to gather an evidence base about the exceptional case funding safety net not being fit for, I just had an email from the legal aid agency about the data breach, about the exceptional case funding safety net not being fit for purpose because they take so long, etc. So we can then say, actually, you need to bring this back into scope, and it becomes an area of publicly funded work where more practitioners can do it rather than those of us who do them cross-subsidising it with other work. So that is my very brief update, because I'm conscious everyone will want to hear from Gillian, who has lots of interesting things to say from the front line of the Send reform campaigning. But if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add for that is that the Lord Chancellor had already changed the guidance to include the possibility for exceptional funding if you had a disproportionate impact on the right to education. So that's much wider than just discrimination, which is what we were arguing about, and that being a civil right. So their own guidance now is much more permissive than it had been a blanket, no, you can't do it. So it isn't just discrimination cases that fall within it. You would look at the impact on there's a lot of information about the adverse impact, and so it's much wider and covers potentially most exclusion decisions can fall under this category. If there's no questions, then as Ollie says, then what would be great is if we could move to Gillian Doherty, who's, as I said at the outset, from Send Action. Gillian speaks with a life experience because she is the parent of a young person with Down syndrome, as well as being the co-director of the Special Needs Jungle, the parent-led organisation focused on SEND news, resources and advocacy. She is working at the moment on research on the Special Educational Needs Tribunal, and is active in the Save Our Children's Rights campaign. I'm sure she'll speak more about her work than what I've said and give you the details, but one of the things that notably she has been involved in as well is as a founder of the Send Action, which is, if you don't know about it, a UK-wide network for SEND rights. And she has used judicial review to challenge policy and advised on university SEND projects as an expert by experience, and we're very fortunate to have her contribution tonight. Gillian.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm in the rather curious position of talking initially about the school's white paper, at least, which is rather difficult because there is virtually no information about the school's white paper. So so that bit of it, at least, is a little bit short. But yeah, so the school's white paper was announced kind of in response to ongoing speculation about SEND reforms, major SEND reforms, and we became very concerned earlier in the year because there had been so little consultation with disabled children, their families, disabled people's organisations, charities, frontline professionals, anybody really. And so we were sort of puzzled really about how you could kind of forge ahead with major reforms without essentially kind of involving most of the major stakeholders. And I think our levels of concerns were raised quite considerably when Dame Christine Lenihan, the government's strategic SEND advisor, basically said at a conference that there was the possibility that education, health and care plans for children with SEND in mainstream schools might be disappearing. So essentially, EHCPs are a major part of individual entitlements and are very important for children with significant needs in mainstream schools. And so that this immediately caused major shockwaves throughout the community of kind of parents and families. And there were also rumours at the same time of, there was a lot of lobbying for the abolition of the SEND tribunal. Or rumours at least that the role for that might be much more limited. So we, I think alongside that, various bits of work that I'm doing directly with some charities and also the Department for Education indicated that there was a lot of interest in the expansion of units within mainstream schools. And I think in the context of all the kinds of things that other people have been talking about, that caused us a lot of concern, because I think there is already a lot of hidden segregation within schools from I think separate provisions of various kinds and with various titles, some of which are official and some of which are unofficial and not even really known about or monitored by Ofsted. So sort of in addition to the kind of, the wider exclusion issues that people have been talking about, there is this kind of versions of hidden segregation in schools. And it's quite a tricky thing to talk about, really, because there are lots of people who support units for various reasons. They can be used positively. They have sometimes been used positively in the past. But I think some of the ways that they're being used at the moment have been extremely negative forms of sort of segregation and, sort of bordering on abuse. And so we were kind of quite concerned at the kind of combination of removing the legal right to individualised assessment and support at the same time as promoting a potentially unaccountable form of exclusion within schools. So we kind of didn't really quite know what to do about this because people weren't talking to the people with experience of the system at that kind of frontline level. So we started something called the Save Our Children's Rights campaign. So we formed together with the SEND Rights Alliance, Special Needs Jungle, IPSI, and SOS SEN, which are organisations that charities that give legally based advice to families of children with special needs. And Learning Disability Today, and an organisation called SEND National Crisis, which organised lots of rallies around about 5 years ago, which was around about the time that we were taking our strategic judicial review, which I might talk a little bit about later. But we just kind of got together really to sort of wonder really about what we could do about these reforms, because we felt that there just wasn't this pre-consultation to essentially inform a good set of proposals, and that given that what appeared to be on the cards were sort of potentially a major assault on disabled children's rights, we felt we needed a seat at the table really quite urgently. So we organised an open letter to The Guardian, which was signed by a lot of major charities, disabled people's organisations, various celebrities, academics with links to law and disability. It was organised very quickly at short notice, so I think we had only about a week to gather signatures, but that kind of had quite a big impact. But at the same time, ticking along behind the scenes, one of our team, Rachel Filmer, had set up a petition, which she had terrible trouble getting registered in the early stages with the petitions committee, because essentially there'd been no specific proposal to get rid of children's rights. And so it wasn't really possible to have a petition about that. So she kind of went back a few times with various different forms of wording, and eventually came up with a general wording that was kind of acceptable to the committee around the government committing to retaining existing legal rights. So that was then accepted. We started to gather signatures, and as we got to 10,000 signatures, we got a first written response, which entirely failed to address the question at all. So the petitions committee also noticed this and requested an actual response to the petition, which I think was still kind of pretty weak, and said, I think, some of the things that people have already mentioned about there will always be, a right to support, but not actually mentioning education, health and care plans, or referencing the existing system. So we kept pushing the petition for a while, and at the same time, we got parents to write to their MPs. So IPSI set up a really helpful general template kind of outlining the issues, but also invited people to add their personal information about their child and what their education, health and care plan had meant for them, what it had enabled them to do, and to make it kind of quite personalised. And we also were furiously kind of briefing MPs about the debate ourselves as well. So we tried to speak to as many MPs as possible over the last few months. So we eventually hit 100,000 signatures and managed to get a parliamentary debate, which took place last week on the 15th. And we had, there was a debate in Westminster Hall, and it was very crowded, apparently, by any standards. So it was standing room only with MPs, and the public gallery is tiny, but it was full. And what was fantastic, I think, for us, after feeling kind of really on the back foot about things, was having lots of MPs who had clearly heard from their constituents with personal stories, and had held surgeries and meetings with them to hear from them, and were representing their constituents very directly, talking about the number of people from their constituency who had signed the petition. And it sort of felt like a very personalised response. So I think lots of MPs hear from people all the time about SEND, but this was the first time kind of families' views on this particular issue of retaining legal rights had really been heard clearly. And the petition's still open. It's open for another 2 weeks, I think. It's up to 127,000 signatures now, and we're just trying to get as many as possible, and are planning to hand it in at Downing Street once it closes. But really, I think what's been really important has been shifting the narrative. So actually, as it happens, on the same day that we managed to get this debate in Parliament, there was an entirely separate group of parents working with the Disabled Children's Partnership on a rally in Parliament Square. And it wasn't at all part of our planning and was totally beyond our control, but I assume someone in the petitions committee decided to put it on the same day. So actually it ended up being quite a powerful event, because I think there were around about 700 families outside in Parliament Square. So MPs were coming down to talk to them and hearing those kind of personal stories, but it was very much in the context of people really talking about their legal rights and what they meant to them. And I think that was very powerful to hear from families directly, given that their voices hadn't really been heard until that point. So at this point in the campaign, we're slightly paused. I think we feel like we've taken a really big step forward, in the sense that actually there's a new minister who's already indicated that she's open to meeting families to discuss this further. We are now taking stock and trying to expand our reach and hear from a wider range of families, because actually we think it's really important that as part of these reforms, they hear from a much wider range of stakeholders than the usual ones. So I think just looking at kind of intersectionality, I think we feel like a lot of the kind of traditional channels for engaging with families means that there are a large number of families who are not well represented by those groups. And so we're trying to make space to hear from a much wider range of stakeholders. So it looks as though the white paper, which has been incoming, I think, since January. I think the latest is that it's going to be out in the autumn, but we've heard that the autumn can extend right up until next January. So we're not quite sure when it's coming. I guess it will come when it's ready. But I think what's welcome is actually that at this point, we feel that delay is a positive thing, that it's perhaps a sign that people are sort of stopping and thinking about what they're doing, what the potential adverse impact of certain sorts of proposals are. So at the moment, I think one of the reasons why I was quite keen to come and talk to everyone today is that, first of all, I think we're kind of worried about the impact of some of the proposals on schools, in terms of the difficulties that they already have kind of complying with their duties, and the kind of lack of resources, and the fact that accountability in relation to exclusions is something that I think families find more difficult to access. So I think one of the things about the narrative about early intervention is that obviously early intervention is a good thing and it sounds really positive, but actually if early intervention acts as an obstacle to proper assessment and support, then it can become a negative. And I think that we find that there are certain groups of children who are disproportionately disadvantaged by lack of assessment and understanding of their needs. And so I think for us, any potential kind of raising of thresholds for assessment, or having children essentially being supported only by schools without, for example, having had their speech and language needs assessed, could be really problematic, because we know that those children are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and things like that. So we feel it's really important that the right to assessment and support is retained. And so just one other thing that we're doing is that actually we're co-producing some research at the moment on the Sen Tribunal, because we felt, again, a lot of people have talked about the importance of evidence, but we felt that there was very little evidence really about what was happening at the tribunal, why things were ending up at the tribunal, which people were able to access it, which people weren't able to access it, and that actually information from that could be used to drive systemic improvement in really important ways. So we've applied for funding and we're hoping that comes. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear from anyone who might be able to support our campaign, who might be able to help us to prepare to respond to the consultation, and particularly think about the potential legal issues that might raise.
Great, well, thank you very much, Gillian. I can certainly say that within the School Inclusion Project, we'd like to publicise your petition. I don't know if we've done that already, but we obviously would try and do that and distribute this possibility to contribute. So thank you for taking the lead on that. I don't know if there are any specific questions.
Yeah, there was one question on sort of involving the voices of children, Gillian. I don't know if you want to address that one.
Yes, we're trying to do that much more, and we need to work really hard to improve, because I think we feel that a lot of disabled children's and young people's voices are heard through quite carefully orchestrated groups, often run by charities, and that actually that those kind of forums can lack authenticity and meaningful representation. And I think that often happens to parents too, I think, that our voices are kind of not heard very directly, but are sort of, I don't know, I guess kind of processed and made slightly more palatable perhaps sometimes. And I think that in the same way that kind of we are trying to establish more direct channels, we need to make space for disabled children and young people to do that. I'm not sure that we're necessarily the right people to do that, because I think parents, I think it's kind of a collective responsibility really. But I think that there is a role for parents in representing some young people who are not always covered by. So we're trying to do some work with disabled people's organisations and their youth groups, and have some outreach that way. But I think also we're conscious that actually for some children, parents are quite an important voice, but we want to hear from other voices. So we're really open to kind of ideas and things moving forward as we expand the next stage of the campaign.
I think Deborah has her hand up to comment on that.
I do. I couldn't put a question in the chat, I think maybe because I'm on the panel or I can't use Zoom, one or the other. But I just wanted to know whether you had any comments on the Select Committee report, and whether you thought it was positive, and whether you think there is going to be any attention paid to it, or is it a bit late now for any attention to be paid for it with the coming reforms?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about timings, because I know that originally the timing for the white paper was going to be before it looked as though that report was out, and we did point out that would be quite a bad look, and I think that was the point at which it got postponed. But yeah, I think there were lots of positives in it. Actually, it was surprisingly positive, and we kind of welcomed quite a lot of the proposals. I think unfortunately probably the thing that it was weakest on was the financial side of things, and actually one of the problems with the reforms is that they're being driven by financial concerns rather than the needs of children, and so the fact that that was a kind of weak point in that was a cause for concern. But I think what was welcome was the commitment to children's rights. I think that where there needs to be, and also kind of drawing attention to the lack of a clear definition of inclusion, which I think is really important. Had an interesting conversation at a strategic litigation workshop run by the Alliance for Inclusive Education today, and we were sort of feeling like the issue of not having an agreed working definition of inclusion was quite problematic, and that actually perhaps there needed to be sort of clarification on that, from a kind of legal perspective, not just a kind of government policy perspective, in terms of just thinking about what that might mean for accessing an inclusive education, a mainstream education moving forward.
I think that's the bottom line, isn't it? Is that their focus is cost saving, when obviously we know that it's a system that's starved of resources. in so many different ways, and probably one piece of important research would be to try to work out is if you do not make this provision when it's needed and when it's identified early, what are the consequential costs? And they're going to outweigh what it costs to actually properly support these children in the first place. I don't know which universities or if there's somebody doing research on that, but I think that, you know, obviously we can talk about the dramatic adverse impacts for young people, but also the cost to the country, to the society of not actually investing in those young people when they need it most. That's kind of the message, isn't it? And if that's what you've got as a government that's thinking about that, then that's quite important information to have. Sorry, make a contribution.
Thanks, Julia, that was really, really interesting. I just wanted to flag, maybe you're already completely on top of it, that the Children's Commissioner published a report 2 weeks ago. And D'Souza's quite influential. And I think although we shouldn't take it as, of course, it's not government policy, we should be thinking that maybe this is a direction of travel. And there were lots of alarming headlines about her supporting EHCPs being removed. My colleague went to the launch and it wasn't quite as alarming as it looked. There's this big focus on defining a child's needs kind of in a broader umbrella of additional needs. So looking at if a child is a carer, if a child has a special educational need, if a child has been bereaved, for example, and then just sort of pulling all of those things under one big panel and having different and maybe giving them just a care plan or just a health plan, and then having some kind of fast tracking system for children with lifelong or permanently disabling or life-threatening conditions. So you've probably already seen it, but I just wanted to make sure that you had, because it might be an interesting indication of the way the government might go.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that actually, because I think we were quite frustrated by that report in the sense of it sort of felt somewhat as though it was reinventing the wheel, because the whole point of an education, health and care plan is that it's a holistic assessment of needs, and you don't really know what the needs are until you assess them. So how do you decide what kind of plan and support a child needs without assessing them? And I think that's the worry, because I think that there are some children who are not having equal access to those kinds of assessment and support. And I think the worst potential outcome of any reforms would be to make it more difficult for those children to get a proper understanding of their needs and support in place, or to delay access to them. I think that would be a really poor outcome of any reforms.
Thanks. I'm sorry, nodding furiously, but you can't see me. It seems like the crux of it is the individualization, right? And the thrust of all of these reforms are going towards kind of tariff-based system or something for schools, some kind of people premium-esque. Let's just give a bit of extra money to schools and they can spend it how they like. And the problem is, how do you get the money to the child, and how do you make sure that child's needs have been identified and there's some kind of accountability?
It's exactly that, and I think there's a lot of emphasis on kind of generic packages or sort of certain kinds of initial teacher training, which sound quite potentially useful, but quite light touch, and I think which sort of doesn't really acknowledge the role for kind of wider professionals and support and assessment. So I think conversations that we've had with schools, who I think often, and I'm talking the inclusive schools here particularly, are really under-resourced in terms of supporting children. And I think that they are, you know, absolutely crying out for additional support and training and all sorts of things like that. But, you know, those wider workforce kind of issues of support really need to be kind of stipulated. I think anything that leaves schools and children and families more isolated won't be a positive step forward.
Yeah, I was just comment on that with experience that I've had of where there's a dispute, where the school is saying the behaviour is not related to any special education need, it's just bad behaviour. And you just see how, if you haven't got that plan in place, you don't have the independent specialist expert assessment that you need. That's why I think, you know, in that context, it's particularly important, and it's really difficult when when the school is taking that approach and they'll say, well, we've got special educational needs experts, I'm such an expert and we don't think it's to do with that. If you do not have that in place because the school has not facilitated it and the parent doesn't understand that they can obtain it and they can make the referral, you're in a real difficult situation. And I think there is a sort of mentality that I've seen anyway within schools that we do have this expertise to make the assessment, and that really needs to be challenged because obviously they don't have the full range of expertise that you get if you've got a proper assessment. Plus, they're not independent, and unfortunately, even though obviously you want the school to be fighting the child's case and getting the best provision that they can within the resources, that isn't always what happens for this particular group of kids, and that's the context in which you see quite a lot of exclusions taking place. So, for that kind of practical reason, ensuring that there's the opportunity for independent specialist, holistic assessment is really critical.
I think just something else is just also the timing of it. So you can apply for the EHCP, they're not getting done in 20 weeks. They're taking so long, and it's impacting year on year. And then if you're able to then get it, they're not getting the support for quite a long period of time.
Yeah.
And, to go and get an expert report for speech and language, for all of the different things that you suspect your child might have, because they won't see you. So you're just waiting and waiting and waiting, and you've got behaviour deteriorating, and then you've got schools that can't cope, haven't got the funding, and yes.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a point you were making about independent assessments from schools. Something that I found as a parent of a child who later got diagnosed with autism and ADHD was what we kept saying as parents, look, we think there's an issue, and they kept saying, oh, but she's fine, she's fine. So reports would go off to CAMS. The school is saying we don't see any problems because she was able to mask in that small environment, but we were seeing problems. And I think increasing, obviously, having something external, but also increasing education within schools. But that's something that I know has affected quite a lot of parents. I know that you basically end up being blocked. It took us 7 years to get an assessment with a lot of fighting and a lot of school trauma.
And then you have a discrediting of the system, because what's now said is if you've got the money to pay for it, then you can access it, and then that is it's having some distorting impacts that are being picked up on, and so funding is, and that at the right time as quickly as you can is obviously the solution. It doesn't take a select committee, really, should it, to work that out, because it's obvious, but there you go. Do we have any other?
One final. Oh.
Can I just add something to that point?
Sure.
I've also had the opposite with a client not having any luck with CAMS of getting assessed and actually agreeing to pay for it privately, but then having the school reject it because it's private.
Because it's it's in lots of different ways. It's become a way of discrediting the system. But the underlying reason is obviously that it's just not properly funded and should be.
One sort of conceptual question, I think. Let's say in an ideal world where funding is no issue, will the scrapping of EHCPs be a problem if all schools are fully funded for inclusive education?
No.
Gillian, what do you think?
I mean, if that ever happened, that would be amazing. But even if it did happen, then I guess it could very easily not happen at any time with a change of government. And I suppose you kind of legislate for things not going well. So I think that it's an incredibly important backstop. I think we're so far from being fully funded and having an inclusive education system that feels, just a really long way off.
Can I add that just the section I read just from the Nick Gibb book shows that the idea of giving all power to school leaders might not necessarily be the best thing without any oversight.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is that you can't make provision if you don't know properly what the need is. So you have to recognise that while schools are obviously experienced and expert in what they're doing, they're not speech and language experts, they're not psychologists, they're not a doctor. And so the whole point of that is you're getting additional expertise that can help you to identify these needs. And I think we've really got to hold on to that, both for reasons of expertise and independence. That's certainly what I would think is really important about it all. Yeah, so I think on that note, unless there's any other contributions, can I say thank you very much to the excellent contributions that we've had. There are action points that we'll follow up on, and I hope that this has continued to inspire you in your work. You're often hitting your head against a wall, brick one, or a chalkboard or whatever it is, but there's a lot of people who are working in this area for the right reasons, and we just have to keep going at a time of disappointment really, in the way in which we'd hoped for there to be something positive coming out of change of government, but instead we're seeking to have to hold on to what we thought was already inadequate and weak, rather than really building on improving a system. It seems to be we're having to retrench really and maintain what's in place, but obviously knowing that that's not adequate and it needs a massive injection of funds and commitment to the education of all our children. So that's the work that we're all involved in. Thank you for attending. Obviously there'll be another SIP meeting, is it about 3 months? We'll have 3 or 4 months, in 4 months, but access to the website is there, and if you have cases that you need to that's the way in which we can continue in the interim between the meetings to communicate on issues and to follow up these meetings. Thank you to all of our speakers.